Today we're going to talk about the circular saw, safe operation, utilizing how to make some adjustments and things on it, and then use it. From your readings and safety rules, which you already should have taken a look at, you should be able to see on that diagram and remember from your diagram some of the basic parts and anatomy of the saw. Sometimes it's important to note that we call it a circular saw, and that's the official name. Some people will refer to them as Skil saws. That's because the Skil brand is the first one to have made the circular saw. Take a look at some of the anatomy of the saw. That's a pretty straightforward and tool. You have a motor housing and where all the motor things happen. Handle with a trigger, and then another handle here to use as your guide hand. All right, when you look at the actual saw itself, we'll flip it over and I'll give you kind of a quicker rundown. This piece right here is known as the table, okay? And then there is a retractable guard, and so this guard will retract and open up some of the blades as you push the saw through the work. This piece pushes on the board and it opens up like that as you go across, protecting you from the back side of the saw. In some applications, you may need to open that guard up a little bit before you start the saw, small pieces of work, different things that may tend to bind or catch right there, and that's what this handle here is for. And so sometimes you may need to start sawing in kind of this position, pushing that forward with this finger, or pushing it having it forward with your thumb. It's important to note though that as you start, as soon as you kind of get started, you can let that go and let that guard swing back to where it's at, and it'll continue to ride all the way through. But you may have to start in that position, usually this position, sometimes this, depending on what's more comfortable for you. This particular saw is also an adjustable table, and so you can see if you loosen this particular little plastic wing nut right here, the table will adjust. That allows you to make up to 45-degree angled cuts in your wood, okay? And so you can make that adjustment, tighten that back down, and then make your cut at a 45 or whatever degree angle that you need it to be. When you bring that table back up to be completely flat, it's a good idea to take it, once you've done that, open your guard up and just take a square really quickly and lay it on that table, making sure that you're still at a perfect 90. That way you're making straight cuts when you come back into your normal position. The other thing that it's important to note is that when using a circular saw, you also are going to adjust the depth that the saw will run at. Many people, if you've operated one before, you probably grab the saw, take it, and start cutting, right? Now, if you lift this lever right here on the back of the saw, and I'll do that again. If you lift that lever, okay, that adjusts the depth that the saw goes at. Using a circular saw, you should always adjust the depth so that the blade only sticks out 1/8 of an inch below the bottom of the wood. And that 1/8 of an inch is pretty easy to tell because it's basically the tip of one of these teeth, okay? Now, why do such a thing? Why not just leave it all the way down and just rock and roll and go at it? Well, there's a couple of different reasons for that. Number one, if you have it in this lower depth, when you go to cut, the only part of the saw that's doing any kind of cutting is this very front. Whereas when you adjust the depth, you now have all of this part of the saw who's making its cuts. You get a smoother and less splintered cut as you go through by adjusting the depth. The other reason is that if the saw blade is all the way down below like that, and you're using this saw and you're cutting and it's way down like that, and you move just right as you're cutting, it's a good way to take a nice little chunk out of the leg. So always make sure that before you use that saw, you adjust the depth so that there is one tooth, one tip of the tooth below, or basically 1/8 of an inch. Now the saw works just like any other tool. There's a trigger right here. This particular version does not have a release on it, but several have a safety release where you have to push another little button so you can pull the trigger back and go. One last thing to kind of mention is that if you have to change the blade on this saw, it is pretty easy. There's a little lever right here that you push down, and you push that down until the saw locks, and so the blade locks into position. It comes with a built-in wrench. You loosen the nut that's right here, and you pull the blade off, put the new one on, making sure the teeth are going the way that they're supposed to go, and tighten that back down, and then pushing that lever back in, just snug it down really tight. All of the things that I've just shown you, it goes without saying, but need to make sure you mention it, that you don't do any of those things with the tool plugged in. Always make sure that the tool is unplugged before adjusting the table, adjusting the depth of the table, or most importantly too, making sure you're changing a blade. Okay? You make everything you do to that saw, you do with it unplugged. You never plug it in until you're just about ready to make that cut. Now, one of the things that sometimes people struggle with when using the saw is trying to figure out how to stay on the cutting line. Because when you look at the front of the saw, it gets a little bit confusing because there's these two notches. And they're always in the way, and you don't know what side do I put the line on, where do I cut on, how do I do all that stuff. If you look, and I think it from this way is the best, if you look straight down on that saw, you'll see that the blade of this saw lines right up with this particular notch on the saw. So when you're making all normal type cuts and straight on cuts, this notch is lined up right with this blade. This particular notch then is what in your board is going to be the curve, or the place that the saw blade goes. And so you don't line your line up in the middle of that, but you basically line up to one side or the other depending on what the waist side of your board is, and the material that's going to be lost is that notch. The other notch is for when you've set your blade on an angle cut. And the way to remember that is that the notch that has a little angle cut out of it is the notch you got line up to when you're making angle cuts. If you're making straight on cuts, you just use the other one. Now, the width of a saw blade is 1/8 of an inch. And so I've always found it helpful that when I'm ready to make a cut with this particular saw, that I basically draw two lines. The first line, if I'm going to make this cut at 2 inches, I'll draw my first line at 2 inches, okay? And this is the 2-inch piece that I want. I'll then make a second line 1/8 of an inch on the waist side of the board. I'll make that second line 1/8 of an inch from my 2-inch line on the waist side of my board. What I've got now is this little bitty area right here, which is the place that my saw blade is going to go, just like this notch. So when I'm ready to line up, all I do is I put each line on either side of this opening, and I just run on both sides. That way I don't get confused which side of the line I need to cut on. Now, I'm going to make my mark. I'm also going to line up on each side. And the other thing that's nice about a circular saw is when you're working, you will hold and look over. You can actually watch the blade if you stand and look over the top of the saw, okay? Now this is a right-handed saw, so that means that I'm going to use my right hand and pull the trigger on the right side, and I'm going to use my left hand to guide the saw in such a way. I'm going to make sure that the saw sits flat on my piece of work all the way through, and I'm also going to make sure that the motor side, or the heavy side of the saw, is on the bench side or the clamp side of my work. That way, as I go all the way through, the piece that's going to fall away is just going to fall away, but all of this is going to stay on this side of the bench. If I were to cut from the other direction, as that piece goes to fall away, that saw is going to tip and want to kick out and make a big old notch in the side of my work. So you always put the motor and heavy side of the saw on the workbench, heavy side, sturdy side of your cut, so that you don't have any of those kickouts and problems. From there, I'm just going to go ahead and line up my saw, make sure I'm straight and ready. I'm going to get ready to go. And my depth has already been set, so once I'm ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and plug my saw in. I'm going to make my cut. When I'm done with my cut, I'm going to make sure that that saw has come to a complete stop, and the blade has come to a complete stop and isn't spinning it anymore before I set it down on the bench, and then I'll clean up my work and be done. So I'm going to line everything up. It's also important to note that when lining up like this, my blade is actually touching the piece of work right now. And so before I pull the trigger, I may get lined up, but I'm going to back off a little ways so that when I pull the trigger, the saw is clear of any wood, and and then the blade will come to full speed before I start to make my cut. The other thing you'll notice is that when I got done, before I made sure that I stayed with my saw all the way through. I didn't see the work start to fall off, so I let off the trigger. I made sure that the saw went all the way through to the pass, and I kind of picked up like that. You always make sure you go all the way through. Otherwise, there's a chance that if you stop too soon, the work may fall away, but you'll have a little bit of piece left right here, or you'll chip pieces and things. Always make sure that you follow all the way through and stay with it to the very end. From there, I made sure that my blade was stopped before I set it down. I'm done using the saw today, so I'm going to unplug it and be done. In class, you're going to go ahead and take the safety test and practice working with this saw today, so we'll see you there.